Hey guys, I am sorry I am not in class today. My youngest is sick, so I figured the easiest way to do this was just to go ahead and record the video and let the substitute show it so that we don't get behind. Um, so first of all, you should have your notes by now. The sub should have handed those out, and then you should also have a chart that looks like that. What we are going to do with this is we are going to fill it in as we go so that you have a nice visual of the breakdown of the plant classification according to the groups that we discuss. But first, um, let's just start with our introduction. This is the section that we're going over in the book in case you need your book. Let's talk about classifying plants. Plants are classified in a few different ways. One is by how they transport water. There are structures in plants that transport the water from the roots to the stems and to the leaves, and these are called vascular plants. Now, if the plants don't have these tube-like structures to transport water, they are called non-vascular plants. And this is the first grouping that we are going to talk about is non-vascular and vascular plants. Um, so non-vascular plants, I kind of just hinted at that. They don't have roots and tissues and those tube-like structures for conducting water. So they actually have to absorb the water nutrients through their leaves. Because they don't have roots, and they are just absorbing directly into their leaves, they do not get very tall. All of these non-vascular plants that we're going to talk about are very short. So let's talk about a few of them. First one is moss. I'm sure many of you have seen moss. We have a great big rock in our by our front porch. We have a little bitty rock garden. It's got a rock about this big, and it's just covered in moss because that area doesn't get too much sun, and it gets a lot of water from the guttering overhead, and so it grows moss really, really well. Moss really stays, like I said, pretty small. It can be anywhere from a few millimeters, this big, to up to a little over 2 feet tall. This is obviously more the exception to the rule. The stuff that you find is probably going to be about this big at most. Um, you will notice when you pull moss off of a tree or a rock that there's these little fibers. Those aren't actually true roots. They look like roots, but they are actually called rhizoids. Now remember that. That's one of your terms. They are called rhizoids. They are not true roots. They have very, very tiny leaves. Sometimes the leaf on a moss can be as thin as a cell thick. That is smaller than you can even imagine. Um, Now, one of the great things about moss is that anytime an area is destroyed by a volcanic eruption, mosses are one of the first plants to be able to grow back. Um, they also are really great at helping to prevent erosion because all those tiny little rhizoids hold onto the soil really well. And some mosses can even be used for heating, cooking, and medicines. So they're a very beneficial plant, even though we don't tend to give them a whole lot of attention. Another non-vascular plant is called liverworts. And here's a picture of liverworts. Um, Notice that is not an A. We're not talking a wart like what you might have on your finger, but the name does come from the shape of the leaf because it looks like a liver. So whoever named the plant decided we were going to call it liverworts. Um, Liverworts also have rhizoids. Again, these plants don't have true roots to collect their nutrients. They have rhizoids, and they get water and nutrients directly through their leaves. Just like mosses, liverworts grow in moist places because when you don't have a root system and you're getting all your water from your plants, you need there to be water present a lot of the time. A lot of times, liverworts get mistaken for mosses. They are very different, um, even though at a glance and especially at a distance, they're going to look the same. Now, so what we're going to do first before we move on is we're going to go back to this chart, and you should at least be able to figure out this non-vascular portion. The two plants that we discussed were mosses and liverworts. So I want you to fill those in on your chart. Next, we're going to go back over. Oh, it's going to make me discard this every time. We're going to go back over here. What are we talking about now? Now we're going to talk about some vascular plants. So you go back to your chart and you write vascular on this side because this is opposite of our non-vascular plants. Remember our mosses and our liverworts. So now you write vascular plants, and we're going to start by talking about seedless vascular plants. That is another type of classification for plants because plants are also described by whether or not they bear seeds. Not all plants do. So the seedless vascular plants, the first one we're going to talk about are horsetails. You got pictures here, you've got pictures on your notes. These, because they do not have seeds, they have to reproduce in a different way. And what they do is they have underground stems called rhizomes. Make sure you study so that you can remember the difference between a rhizoid, which is a root-like structure that anchors a plant, a non-vascular plant, and rhizomes, which is how seedless vascular plants propagate or reproduce. Horsetails are usually tall, hollow, and have jointed stems. You can see on this picture each one of those sets of lines, that's another joint. Sometimes they have needle-like branches, like this picture. Sometimes they have small brown or colorless leaves on the stem itself, but for the most part, they all follow one of these two appearances, where it's just this tall, it looks like it's just a stem, or it has those little spiky leaves coming off of it. They produce their food in their stems and branches, not in their leaves. When we learn about plants, we talked about this with cells. Plants have chloroplasts, which have chlorophyll inside of them, and the chlorophyll is responsible for the process of photosynthesis. Well, that chlorophyll and those chloroplasts are in the leaves, and that is where the vast majority of photosynthesis takes place. Horsetails are not like that. Horsetails produce their food in their stems and branches rather than in their leaves. And you will find horsetails along riverbanks, marshes, ditches, and meadows. So if we flip over to our chart again, you should have all those three filled in. Notice seedless is already filled in with horsetails. So let's talk about our next one. And that is a club moss. Now, pay attention to this. Even though they look like moss, they are not the same plant. I know the name makes it confusing, but they are not the same plant. They actually look like little bitty tiny evergreen trees. They are not going to be any bigger than a foot tall. But they don't have very much in common with actual moss. This is one of those things where somebody named it because it looks like moss. The name stuck, even though it technically is not a good name. You do find them in forests near streams, and they live on trees in tropical areas. Now, the next one that we're going to talk about are ferns. And I notice I have two very different pictures here. This is what an adult fern is going to look like. There are over 12,000 species of ferns. Obviously, this is a very large group. You will find ferns by streams and waterfalls and in heavily wooded areas. If you've ever gone hiking, you've probably seen this plant. These also grow from rhizomes. Again, what's the difference between a rhizome and a rhizoid? Answer it out loud. Go ahead. Yeah. A rhizoid is a root-like structure that anchors the plant. A rhizome is how the plant reproduces when it doesn't bear seeds. Um, Now, these very leafy branches, those are called fronds on a fern. And baby ferns are coiled up like this before they are fully grown. And so they're called a fiddlehead because it looks like the end of a fiddle or a violin. Um, you're probably more familiar with a violin than a fiddle. Now, ferns are actually one of those plants that can get much, much larger than the other non vascular plants. The others that we talked about, or excuse me, let me back that up. They're not non vascular. Just kidding. Ferns can get very large. Forgive me, I've got a sick child and I've only had one cup of coffee. Um, so you need to go back to your chart. And what you're going to do here is you're going to fill in this box. We talked about club mosses. We talked about horsetails. What did we just finish talking about? Ferns. Very good. Now, let me just double check something. Okay. All right. And that is where we are actually going to stop the notes today. Um, your sub is going to have you watch this video, The Reproductive Lives of Non-Vascular Plants from Crash Course Biology, just to help you learn a little bit more about liverworts and mosses. There is another one that they talk about called hornworts. You don't need to know about that one for the test. Um, but it's a really cute little video that kind of talks about some of the bizarre features of non-vascular plants. You do not have homework tonight, but if you finish this video and this video before the end of class, then what you need to do is you need to start working on your vocab for chapter 6. That is the chapter we are in. We are skipping chapter 5 because you go really in depth with animal classification. Say it with me, next year. But we're going to focus on plants this year. So be nice to your sub. And hopefully, if you've got any questions, I should be back tomorrow and I can answer those. Thanks, guys.